Hello. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Credit Scoring and the Unscored, Alternative Data Reporting, hosted by the Asset Coalition Toolkit for States, the Sargent Shriver Center on Poverty Law, CETA of Cook County, and the Policy and Economic Research Council. My name is Susan Rataka, and I'm a Community Investment Associate at the Shriver Center. I'll be moderating the webinar today along with Karen Harris, the Supervising Attorney at the Shriver Center's Community Investment Unit. First, a few housekeeping matters. If at any point during the webinar you're having technical difficulties, please call or email Lisa Domaraki at 312-368-1154 or at lisadomaraki@povertylaw.org. All attendees will be automatically muted. However, attendees will be able to ask questions using the control panel. We will forward questions to the presenters as we receive them, and the presenter may choose to answer questions either at the close of their presentation or at the end of the webinar. We would like this to be interactive, and all the presenters welcome your questions. We will be asking several polling questions which will help us understand who is participating in the webinar. Your general interest in credit reporting, your initial perspective on alternative data's impact on access to credit and credit scores, and if the webinar offered you new information on these issues. Our first question is for you to describe the organization you represent today. If your organization is not listed in the choices, or you're participating in the webinar today but not representing another constituency, please select Other. We'll just wait a few minutes for everybody to make their choices. Okay, it looks like the majority of folks on the webinar today are with consumer service providers or nonprofit organizations. Before we launch into our panelist presentations, I'd like to provide a brief overview of the field of asset building and how it relates to credit. Asset building aims for households to acquire the financial resources to get ahead in life, not just get by. Most people have heard of income poverty, which focuses on a household's current income level. Asset poverty, on the other hand, focuses on a family's total household wealth. A household is considered asset poor if it does not have enough income to meet its needs or expenses for 3 months if all outside sources of income have disappeared. More than 1 out of every 5 U.S. households and approximately 1 in 4 women-headed households are asset poor, and asset inequality is even more pronounced by race. 37% of non-white households are asset poor in the U.S. Building towards asset ownership ensures that there are adequate financial reserves to weather a financial crisis, build economic stability, and shield a household from poverty. Credit reporting is a fundamental way people build assets. Credit enables us to secure a loan for a home, school, or small business, in addition to accessing funds and capital. Without a credit score, consumers are relegated to finding other means of building assets. Historically, this has been through borrowing money from family or friends or other businesses, being forced to pay higher down payments or deposits to establish accounts, or paying high interest rates to secure loans from unregulated loan companies. In order to alleviate asset poverty, more opportunities for low-income families to build credit are needed. This means that both access to credit and mechanisms to improve scores are necessary. When discussing credit and asset building, it's important to note that between 50 and 70 million people nationwide have either no credit score at all or a thin credit file. A thin credit file means that an individual's credit score is based on only 2 or 3 pieces of information, such as a credit card or a loan. Our next polling question asks whether or not, what you think about the current credit reporting system. Do you believe the current credit reporting system is transparent, fair, and accurate? Is this the best way for consumers to build credit? Okay, we just wait a few more minutes. Looks like the majority of people do not agree with this. The next question we're going to ask is, do you think that most people understand what is currently being reported? The majority of you have answered that no, most people do not understand. Our next question is that we'd like to determine a baseline of attendees' perspectives based on what you currently know about alternative data reporting. Today's focus is on access to credit. When we talk about access, we're talking about 2 issues. First, whether or not people have access to the mainstream credit industry. And second, assuming that they do, can they access or obtain credit to purchase assets? In other words, do you believe including alternative credit data in credit reports will help low-income families get access to the mainstream credit industry? The majority have answered that it will increase. Assuming alternative credit reporting will increase access to mainstream credit, will such reporting increase, decrease, or leave unchanged low-income families' credit scores? %49 said increase. Oh, and 33% are unsure. These issues are the basis of today's discussion. These questions will be addressed by our panelists, and at the end of the webinar, we'll ask your opinion again about the impact of alternative data and credit reporting. And with that, let me introduce you to our panelists today. Dr. Michael Turner is a president and senior scholar of the Policy and Economic Research Council. John Hoat is a senior policy analyst at the National Consumer Law Center. Jennifer Smith is the Director for Home Energy Assistance Programs at CEDA of Cook County. Terry Clemens is the Executive Director of the National Credit Reporting Association, and Carol Wayman is the Federal Policy Director of the Corporation for Enterprise Development. Our first presenter today will be Michael Turner from Perk.
And other panelists, can you please put yourself on mute?
So good afternoon. I appreciate your joining me. My name is Michael Turner. I'm the president of Perk, and thank you so much for pulling this panel and this webinar together. Very grateful to the Sargent Shriver Center for this opportunity. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Perk, we're a 501c3 nonprofit policy research organization. Our focus is on asset building and wealth creation through credit access. The vision of Perk is to increase access to mainstream credit, both in the U.S. and globally, by more than any single institution through information solutions. That is, through adjustments in the credit information sharing system, for example. We've done extensive work in economic and policy research, some of the results of which I'll be sharing with you today. And we've advised the federal government on consumer credit, data privacy, data security, and credit information sharing matters here in the U.S. as well as state governments, and at this point, governments in over 20 countries as well. So with the introduction, we have a general sense of the scope of issues we're going to be covering. But what is the problem? And this was also touched upon. There are effectively an estimated 30 million Americans who are credit invisible. They have no credit files whatsoever. And up to 75 million who are thin file. And we at Perk define thin file as fewer than 3 accounts or trade lines in your credit file. And in most cases, with most credit scoring models, this means that those individuals are what's called unscorable. That means there's insufficient information in their credit report to generate a credit score. There are also about 120 million Americans with credit scores that are less than 740, and these people may have their scores increased with a more inclusive credit reporting system if there were additional trade lines in their credit file. And that's an estimate from a senior fellow at Perk, Michael Nathans. So clearly, this is a serious issue, and this issue was first broached in 2003 by Congress, who basically mandated that the Federal Trade Commission look at the issue as to whether or not there were data sets out there that were currently excluded from credit files that, if included, would result in a more inclusive and fairer credit or financial services system. The FTC looked at the issue, and their conclusion was yes, but the market is taking care of that. Perk looked at this issue then in 2004 and began qualitatively looking at what is alternative data, toward what end would this be collected, what would the impacts likely be, what are the barriers to having this data reported, and where and to what extent is it currently being reported. And I'm going to share this with you, but I wanted to clear up some basic facts about credit and credit reporting based on interactions I've had over the past 10 years with a variety of policy organizations, advocacy organizations, and others that share Perk's interest in facilitating access to affordable sources of mainstream credit. There is a conception that many hold that energy utility, and I'm talking gas, water, electric, or other forms of utilities like telecoms are not credit. In fact, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and the Fair Credit Reporting Act clearly define these industries as forms of credit. The FACT Act, which was passed in 2003 and implemented in 2004, defined the term credit to comport with a COA. And the term credit in a COA means the right granted by a creditor or debtor to defer payment of debt or to incur debts and defer its payment, or to purchase property or services and defer payments therefor. Thus, a creditor is any person who regularly extends, renews, or continues credit. That means, by those definitions, that, and it's a very broad definition, that utilities, energy services, and telecoms are creditors, and payment from consumers to those service providers are, in fact, credit payments. So clearly, and this is just an objective interpretation of the law, utilities can report payments to consumer reporting agencies, including credit bureaus, and in fact, some do. Now, are utility payments used in lending? This is another question that there's some misconceptions about. In lending, it's optimal for a lender to have a complete and global picture of a borrower. Keep in mind that the current credit reporting system that exists is a solution to a problem of discriminatory lending, what used to be called country club lending, where underwriting, that is credit decisioning, was done overwhelmingly manually and not in an automated fashion. And this resulted in quite a few suboptimal outcomes, where effectively if you would go to a loan officer with a letter of recommendation from a pillar in the community wearing your Sunday best suit, if they didn't like the length of your hair or the color of your skin, they could basically turn you down for credit. And so this led to the evolution of a credit reporting system that enabled automated underwriting. And automated underwriting over the last 20 years has become the pervasive mode of credit decisioning, and that is that an applicant will now give permission to a lender to pull their credit report. And a credit report and a credit score, is a reflection of an individual's credit risk, credit capacity, and credit worthiness. Typically, what most people think of as a score is a generic score, and a generic score is effectively to predict the probability that an individual will be 90 days or more late in a payment over the coming 2 years. And so utility payments right now for millions of Americans are being reported fully, that is, timely payments and late payments, to credit bureaus, and they're being used in credit scoring and automated underwriting for purposes of a lending decision. And we're going to show you in detail how that impacts access to credit both for the general population, but more specifically for the thin file population, those who have fewer than 3 trade lines in their credit file. And that group, by the way, overwhelmingly correlates with lower income Americans. It's comprised primarily of lower income Americans, younger Americans, members of disadvantaged minority communities. Furthermore, it's already established, this is already established practice. Fannie, Freddie, FHA have endorsed this, or have used alternative data, have used varying types of alternative data. Mortgage insurers for affordable housing loans and alternative loans use not only the data that Perk is advocating, having fully reported and used for underwriting, but many other non-traditional data sets as well. So effectively, the question we're answering today is whether or not to report, and who benefits and who may suffer and how. And we're going to get into that, but again, I want to address a few more misconceptions about credit reporting so you can fully understand the policy implications and the consequences of reporting or not reporting. There's a system by which data furnishers report to credit bureaus, and it's called Metro 2. It's an industry standard, and there are perceptions that this is a rigid framework and that there's no options for reporting in it. So if a utility company would want to report, they must report in 30-day intervals. Well, this is patently false. In fact, Metro 2 is a flexible system and provides latitude for individual furnishers in a voluntary system. And our credit reporting system is not mandatory. It's voluntary. Financial services institutions don't have to report. They choose to report because they see the benefits of reporting. Similarly, utility companies may, and currently some do, choose to report, and they can choose to report, for example, at 60 days rather than 30 days. Furthermore, they have latitude in determining when to report defaults and what level. So, for example, defaults below $100, they may choose not to report. And they also needn't report the special status of individuals on deferred payments, including LIHEAP recipients. So there's information that can be handled in ways that are very consumer-friendly and that don't distort the credit reporting system. And also, another misperception is that a single late payment, so if I'm late on my utility bill by a month, it's going to slam my score and ruin my score by 100 points or more. Again, this is patently false, and I'll speak more to this later. But I raise this because there was an irresponsible journalist in the Detroit area who created such a doomsday scenario. And after he was confronted, basically a few weeks later, wrote an article that recanted and all but admitted he lied, as those results had never actually happened. But generally with the Fair Isaac score, a FICO score, which is the most widely used of many scores, the recency matters. The impacts of a 30 or 60-day delinquency in a model that's trying to predict whether you'll be 90 days or late is not great and unlikely in most cases to impact your score very much at all. Now, effectively, in the focus of this presentation is going to be on low-income consumers. A recent report on this topic by NCLC, citing data from 1998, showed that even the lowest income quintile, 85%, paid their utility bills on time. And this raises the question, too, that when we're assessing the impact on lower-income Americans, we really can't talk about them monolithically. The impact on lower-income Americans is going to be determined by a number of variables, not universally. Many lower-income Americans, as I will show, are likely to benefit greatly from having this data fully reported. So I think we have to keep that perspective in mind, that just as all middle-income or upper-income Americans won't be impacted similarly, because there are other intervening variables as well. But really, okay, so 85% pay on time all the time. What about the 15% that pay late? Well, again, that depends on how late they were, as I've already averred. It also depends on whether they're collections. If this has gone to collection, this is already reported. Utility companies are already reporting collections to credit bureaus. It also depends on how many trade lines or how many other accounts are in their credit file. So if they're not thin file, but if they have a thicker credit report, late payments are unlikely to have much of an impact, much of a negative impact on credit scores. And again, I'll show compelling evidence on this. And then finally, were they late on other payments? If they've got a series of derogatories on other trade lines, then a late payment in a utility is also unlikely to have much of an impact. But with all this said, the best way to determine an impact is not by speculation. It's in fact by comparing, using real low-income consumers with real credit files and real credit scores to assess the impact. And this is done, frankly, by getting a sample of credit files on low-income Americans, running simulations using real commercial-grade scoring models with and without the fully reported utility payment data to see what the impacts are. We did just that. To set this up, there's two scenarios. Perk is advocating that effectively that utility data be fully reported to consumer reporting agencies. Effectively we see this right now, the status quo is that this data is underreported. So we're really more advocating scenario 2, that utility data is not fully reported or is not sufficiently reported, and we'd like it to be reported. Others who oppose the use of alternative data for credit risk assessment would have really this scenario 1. There, as I've mentioned, millions of Americans already have data reported or included in their credit files, and to prohibit this, to disallow it, would be actually rolling this back and mean that utility data is not reported. So these are the two scenarios we're really talking about. We're not talking about a situation where credit data is not reported and we want to report it. It's underreported and we want to increase it, or we roll it back. This is from a Perk study that we did with the Brookings Institution that we released in December of 2006. And this is from a sample of over 8 million Americans who had one or more energy, utility, or telecoms trade line fully reported in their credit file account for more than a year, from March 05 to March 06. And this focuses only on the utility data. And as you can see, the great majority, and this is the whole sample, the great majority experienced either no change or a minor change. That is, their score declined by less than 10 points, or their score increased by less than 10 points. And that's 2/3. And again, this goes to the point that many have multiple trade lines in their account, so the impact of one or more trade line, positive or negative, is relatively low. Importantly on this, you see that there was a large number, there are over 10% of Americans who can now be scored who were credit invisible before. And this creates a credit catch-22. In order to access affordable sources of mainstream credit, you have to have had credit. It's like trying to get your first job. We'd like to hire you, but we wish you had more experience. It's the same thing here. Who are the largest net beneficiaries? We see that when we include energy utility data, the Hispanic borrowers increase access to mainstream credit by 23% and African Americans by 22%. And then if you see the chart on the right, lower income Americans are the greatest net beneficiaries with increased access by 26%, and then in the second quintile is 15%. So clearly those groups that are with the greatest needs and are the greatest credit underserved are the largest net beneficiaries of having utility data fully reported to CRAs. Now let's compare these two scenarios. Again, when utility data is reported but then is disallowed, that if this were prohibited or restricted, those whose scores would worsen from the general population, 28% of scores would be decreased by changing the law and not allowing this to be reported. And 1 in 5 thin file Americans would have their scores decreased. Well, let's look at the other situation, the situation that Perk advocates. If utility data is underreported and is more reported, or if it's not reported and then it's reported, only 16% of the general sample experienced decreased scores and only 13% of the thin file. So again, what we're talking about is if we disallow reporting, more thin file Americans, more low-income Americans, more of the credit disadvantage would actually have their score decrease than with reporting this data. And similarly, if you look at the scores, the share of the scores who get better, if utilities are reported, it's the reverse, the corollary. But importantly, the scoreability, this notion of a low score is always better than a no score. If we stop reporting, if we disallow reporting, 60% of the thin file population will have no score. They will become credit invisible again, and they will be entirely shut out of the mainstream. This is more recent data. It's been suggested that the Perk Brookings study is now dated, that we had a subprime mortgage meltdown in 2007, the greatest financial crisis of our lifetime, and everything's changed, so this can't possibly be true. Well, here's data from a major utility company that was analyzed by Experian, and this is from 2010, from this year. What we see here is that, in fact, the vast majority, again, experience either no or a negligible change in their credit score from having a fully reported utility trade line. And that, again, the vast majority experience an increase when we're looking at the up versus down, the score changes, but 11% of scores increase significantly with the additional trade line. One trade line matters and can make a difference, and that we define significant as more than 10 points. And similarly, if we look at those who have a score decrease, 7 in 10 already had at least 2 derogatories in their credit file, so they were already in low tiers. And this is important too. When we look at the changes in the score distributions, you see here across, if reporting this were going to lower people's scores significantly, and most people would have lower scores, what we would expect is we would expect to see significant growth in the bottom tiers, the sub-zero prime, the subprime. And in fact, we see the greatest growth in the prime tiers. So it suggests that that having this trade line included actually results in a net positive impact for the broad population, but also for the thin file. And again, and we'll discuss the thin file next, this is the broad population. And this is an important point. Many people talk about scores changing and, well, the score went up by 10 points or 50 points, and that matters somehow. Well, that's not really the case. In fact, lenders look at bind analysis, and what matters more is whether or not the change in your score moves you from one risk tier to another. And what we see here is that for the entire population, including this trade line, mattered not much in terms of score migration. These bars show that for the sub-zero prime, 100% either stayed in that or went to a higher tier. And we see that for the prime and the super prime as well. But the subprime and non-prime, this is a variant of prime, this is where we see the most movement. And again, more than 9 and 10 in both cases either stayed within their risk tier or went to a higher tier. So again, we're talking about negligible percentage of the overall population that experienced a downward migration in terms of scored tiers. The same holds for the thin file. This is really compelling. Look at the bar graph on the bottom. Those bars on the left are the thin file who experienced an increase in score as a result of having a utility trade line reported. Those on the right are with a decrease. The bar chart above it shows the same message, massive stability in terms of migration. So we're seeing that most people either stay in the same band or go to a higher band. Let's go back to our scenarios then. Looking at the second case study, if we were to change the current situation where utilities are permitted by law and encouraged, in fact, to fully report to credit bureaus, 11% of the total population scores would decrease, but 90% of the thin files would decrease. And similarly, if we look at the scenario where utilities are underreported, but then suddenly they're more pervasive reported, only 8% of both the general population and the thin file would have their scores decrease. So if you think that having a score decline is a harm, if that's your definition of harm, and we will talk about that as well, clearly disallowing fully reporting utility trade line causes a much greater harm. Let's talk about this, the likely impact of reporting. John Ulsheimer, who is a noted credit scoring expert, said that occasionally 30 and 60-day late payments do not have a lasting impact on a credit score. It's only serious payments that cause damage. That's because the models are designed, again, to predict 90-day plus delinquencies. I provided the link that you can access this, but then what that allows us to assume is that on-time payments, if reported, would clearly benefit the consumer. Moderately late payments below 90 would have a little lasting negative impact, and severely late payments that would be the most impactful are already largely reported via collections to credit bureaus anyway. So reporting this is likely to have a massive net positive benefit on the low-income communities, minority communities, younger Americans, as well as elderly Americans. And again, the number of people who are positively affected, think back to those scenarios, points to reporting. The number of people who would be negatively affected points to reporting. The accuracy of scores. And this is an important point. We're talking about a scenario where data is reported versus it's not reported. Well, when it's not reported, what it means is that the data in the system is less accurate. That means there's more false identifications. They're called type 1 and type 2 errors. They're identifying individuals who are actually high risk as low risk and giving them credit that they can't afford versus and misidentifying people as high risk who are low risk and discriminating against them because of insufficient information. So, clearly we're about better underwriting, and having more information that's predictive minimizes harms. It protects people who can't afford credit from getting credit that would result into overextension and bankruptcy, something that's become prevalent lately. What is the harm? A low credit score, we don't perceive a low credit score as a harm. We believe that an accurate credit score is in everyone's best interest. Again, because we don't want low-risk borrowers mistaken as high risk, and we certainly don't want high-risk borrowers mistaken for low risk. This would result in denying credit to those who can afford it or providing credit to those who can't afford it. I'm seeing I'm pressed for time. I'm going to speed things up a bit. We had the two thin file scenarios. Again, in the scenario, if we exclude data, if we ban this, 13% of consumers will have increased scores, 7% will have scores unchanged, 20%, and this is from the Perk Study, would have decreased scores, and 60% become credit invisible again. These people will be forced to have their credit needs met by payday lenders and pawn shops and other high-cost creditors. This is not mainstream lending. Scenario 2, if we include utility data, those who are credit invisible, that 60%, now have scores, now have access. 20% have increased scores, 7 unchanged, 13 decreased scores. So basically, credit scores make accurate assessments of risk to the extent that we empower it with data and more predictive data. And better scores are more accurate scores. And I would encourage you to look at our website at perk.net. We've got plenty of data about KS and other metrics that evaluate the predictive ability of models given this data. But utility payment data has been shown to be a good predictor of consumer risk. We ran these tests. We worked with the 3 credit bureaus. We worked with major financial service institutions. We did statistical analysis. We looked at the Kolmogorov-Smirnov statistic, and it increased dramatically, particularly for thin file Americans. So is it better to have a moderate or low score or no score? Well, no score consumers are always treated as the highest risk. They're going to be shut out, and this is going to be difficult for them in insurance, in employment, and tenant screening as well. When we look at the thin file population, when we include one trade line, we see a risk profile by score distribution that is virtually identical to the general population. And what you see here is that the red line in this graph are those who had no traditional trade lines and only have an alternative data trade line. You see the vast majority of them benefit. Their scores increase. A small number, in fact below average, have score decreases. As you add traditional trade lines, the impact of the alternative data trade line is overwhelmed by the more traditional trade lines. So you see the purple with 3 or more traditionals. The number of folks who have score declines over 1 year is higher, but that's not because of the alt data, that's because of the traditional trade lines. So this means basically that including alternative data allows more people to enter the credit mainstream. I had hoped to provide some streaming video from an Annie E. Casey Foundation movie on this topic, but we have a testimonial here. This person always dreamed of being a homeowner, and he was basically credit invisible because he paid in cash. He thought he was being credit responsible, and he said, you know, they don't have records that show you paid good cash. If you start reporting your gas and your water and your electric and your telephone bills that you pay with checks in good cash, you will have a record. They will report that. That will be captured. So before I turn it over, I just want to provide a few research canards when you compare what's presented as research. You know, just beware of generalizations. Again, that lower income people monolithically will have a lower credit score if data is included. Again, most low-income consumers see increases, as we've shown empirically. Those were real low-income consumers who had their data reported into actual credit files and were scored with models, and we showed real results. Also, beware of contextless facts that affect inferences. For example, collections are increasing. Therefore, there are more people with delinquency, so more people have lower credit scores. Well, first of all, collections are going to be reported no matter what, and we're not talking about collections. Also, credit scores are dynamic. They're not static. You know, the other odds ratios, they're the probabilities of being in default. And today, you know, at any score point, the odds of being above 90 late are 4 times what they were just 3 years ago. So what that suggests is that, you know, late payments, particularly moderately late payments, the more that that's the pattern, the less that's going to have an impact on your score. Also, beware of unsubstantiated assertions and ask whether a statement has empirical support. Arguments that utility rates vary across states and therefore credit scores are going to be determined by where you live and not how responsible you are. Well, guess what? Wages, income, taxes, cost of housing, rent, cost of food, and many other variables vary across regions as well. So should we not report mortgage or credit card payments because of differences in home prices? It's much more expensive to live in Manhattan than it is to live in Nebraska, for example, or interest rate differences by geography. And finally, beware of kitchen sink approaches, where multiple arguments are offered with thin or little evidence. The plural of many weak arguments is not a strong evidence. It's really a mess. It's throwing things against the wall and seeing what sticks. Just so you know, many organizations support the Alternative Data Initiative that PERC and our partner, Corporation for Enterprise Development and CFSI, we sent out a sign-out letter. And there are groups that support asset building, wealth creation, consumer advocacy from across this country that support this. So it's not just me. There's a growing base of support for this as people get it. I'll look forward to your questions, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Michael. We're running a little bit behind schedule, so I'd just like to ask a quick question that we had come in. When we talk about alternative data and utility data, what does that include exactly? Would that include telephone, sewer, water, cable, cell phones, or landlines? Can you just explain that a little bit more?
Sure. Basically, alternative data would be any regular deferred payment that is currently not included or is underreported in consumer credit files that would be predictive of credit risk. Now, to be predictive, to be classified as predictive, it has to be tested. These are all empirical questions. We've tested energy utility data, so that's gas, water, electric, heating oil, and the like, as well as telecom, so that's wireline and wireless. We have not tested rental data. We have not tested other forms of alternative data that have been suggested. And there are certain forms of alternative data that we'd like to test, like rental, and hope that we could get the results. But until it's tested, we wouldn't endorse having this included in consumer credit report.
Thank you. And now we'd like to move on to our next presenter, which is John Howitt from the National Consumer Law Center. John?
Hello. Are you able to see this screen?
Yes, John, we can see it.
Okay, great. Well, for those of you on this call who don't know us, National Consumer Law Center is a nonprofit advocacy organization that over the past 41 years has sought to build economic security and family wealth for low-income and other economically disadvantaged individuals and households in the U.S. We've drawn on these decades of experience and expertise to provide information, analysis, and input to federal and state legislatures, administrative agencies, and the courts. NCLC is recognized as a nationally preeminent law and policy expert, and we're very active in the areas of both consumer credit and energy and utilities service, particularly as those issues relate to and are important to low-income households. We author volumes Fair Credit Reporting, currently in its 6th edition, as well as Access to Utility Service, a volume now in its 4th edition. This organization was involved in the legislative history and adoption of the Fair Credit Reporting Act back in 1971, and we've been integrally involved with the implementation issues associated with the Act and advocacy around FCRA ever since. And I've worked on energy and utility issues since 1981, not all of them here at NCLC, but all of my work in this field has been from a public interest perspective. So just a little bit of background on NCLC and on me. Well, before getting into this slide presentation, I would like to share some basic assumptions that inform NCLC's thinking on this issue. That is the issue of alternative data reporting more generally, but also full electric and gas utility reporting in particular. First, we would like to respectfully disagree with the notion that credit reporting is the fundamental way that people build assets. People build assets primarily through access to income and the accumulation of savings. We assert that lowering of credit scores raises the cost of credit, and increasingly it impedes access to employment, insurance, and rental housing. So while we agree on the need to build assets in poor households, we do not agree that full utility credit reporting will accomplish that goal. And I'll get into the rationale for that as we go along here. So again, I'm going to focus this discussion primarily on that piece of alternative data reporting, or excuse me, reporting that involves full energy utility reports. That is, reports from electric and natural gas utility companies to the credit reporting agencies. And the starting point here is that these are essential, necessary services. It's well known that they're often unaffordable to low-income households, and it's also well known that loss of this service poses a grave danger to the health and safety of these households, and certainly it makes it impossible for families that experience that loss to participate in any meaningful way in society and in the economy. So the programs and laws that have been adopted at the state and federal levels to protect the access to this service are necessary, they're desirable, and we're going to argue that full utility credit reporting operates contrary to the policy objectives of these programs and provisions. I'm going to try to stick to my 20 minutes here as best I can, but I wanted to note that there was discussion previously regarding empirical research and the notion of empiricism. Well, my understanding of the research to date, while I haven't looked carefully at the more recent data and statistics that my friend Dr. Turner referenced, the older studies from '05 and '06, it's my understanding they're based primarily on data from two, maybe three electric and gas utilities, NICOR, Gas, and Detroit Edison. And I would just urge folks in looking at this information to consider the extent to which there is broad variability around the country in the ways in which utilities operate, the credit and collection practices of the utilities, certainly the demographics of the customer bases, the laws and regulations that pertain to consumer protections and assistance in helping customers make payments on time. So I would just put that caveat out in looking at what was just presented. No, let's see. I beg your pardon. Okay. Most of the proponents that I've heard over the past couple of years in working on this issue, most proponents of alternative data reporting that really want utility reporting, they tend to focus on the notion that consumers who can't be scored currently could be with this type of reporting, and that the reporting will lead to access to better credit, and that's the asset building argument that I've heard most frequently. In terms of utility companies, it's been said, I've seen some reports that reference the extent to which utility companies want to see customers move their bills to the top of the to-pay piles. And that's an understandable objective on the part of utility managers. The fact is the credit and collection problems that companies face these days are far worse than they were even 5 or 6 years ago, and that the problems with arrearages, disconnections, write-off of uncollectible accounts preceded the current economic downturn, but appear to be more structural in the utility system, and structural to the extent they pertain to higher wholesale energy prices, which I don't see anyone predicting relief for. So I've talked to a number of utility executives from around the country, credit and collections executives, about this issue, and clearly there is concern about uncollectible accounts and arrearages. However, each of the executives I've talked with has a real problem with the notion of full utility reporting. And those concerns, if I can summarize them, are around the fees that would have to be paid to credit bureaus in order to accomplish this, and the costs of major modifications to information systems, risks of public relations nightmares, time and expense associated with cleaning up inaccurate reports. So, in short, the companies do have concerns about customer payment behaviors, but they don't want to go the route of full reporting to address these problems. With respect to the reporting agencies, I think it's pretty safe to say that these entities are very much in favor of expanding this new market. if utilities report fully, that'll result in, I'm not clear on credit reporting agency economics intimately, but my assumption is this huge new market would result in tremendous new revenues and profits, and I can understand why the primary of these entities are very interested in pushing this agenda forward and are in many cases funding research and work to promote full utility credit reporting. However, I think there is a failure to consider the realities that many low-income households face in seeking to stay current on their energy and utility bills, and really just in making ends meet and meeting their financial responsibilities in general. There hasn't been enough attention paid to the ramifications of low credit scores. We don't hear enough about what happens with respect to households and individuals seeking employment and insurance, even rental housing, when credit scores are low. And there also are, as we'll get into in a bit, tremendous regional differences in the way utilities operate and the circumstances that utility ratepayers face. And that variability arguably dwarfs the what is the case and the variability that, say, credit card consumers face in different regions of the country. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble with my screen here. All right. Well, very briefly, low credit scores, we know, increasingly have bearing on individuals who are seeking employment. Prospective employers check credit scores when screening prospective employees to a greater and greater extent, and we know that low scores may harm applicants more than no scores or thin files. The same is true with landlords screening prospective tenants. There is some evidence that military security clearance is at times based, at least in part, on financial impacts and circumstances that individuals face. In a letter to Senator Dodd, Chairman Dodd, from the Secretary of the Army, John McHugh, he indicated that soldiers who are distracted by financial issues at home and are not fully focused on fighting the enemy are decreasing the country's military readiness, and that the Army itself is has been a proponent of late in helping to alleviate the pressures of predatory lending that military households face and military individuals face. So low credit scores certainly invite predatory lending activities. We know that. I think most on this call would agree with that. And the Army, the Secretary of Army himself has made note of this problem. All right, let's talk a little bit about the current reporting practices of electric and gas utilities. Again, I think the research that's been touted so far today has focused on the one or two electric and gas utility companies that do in fact fully report. However, a vast majority of regulated electric and gas companies only report to the credit bureaus when an account is written off as uncollectible or is sent to a collection agency. And while this may not be the case for cell phone companies and some landline companies, it undeniably is the case for electric and gas utilities. So only a very small fraction of electric and gas accounts are currently written off as uncollectible. So under a full utility reporting regime, where customers that are 30 or more days late are reported but not written off as are these customers being late, but had they not been written off as had their accounts written off as uncollectible, that these folks would experience new adverse. They're currently going unreported, and they experience adverse reports that would affect their credit scores. And it is true that FICO has reported that a late payment lowers a consumer's credit score by 60 to 110 points, depending on existing credit score, pre-existing credit score. So basically, if we see that the number of adverse reports is going to increase under this regime, and that that reporting results in damage to credit scores, it's impossible to hold on to the illusion that folks who are late on their bills even from time to time aren't going to be harmed by this practice. Now, I'd like to present some data that is obtained that I obtained from public utilities commissions. There will be other data I'm going to present that comes from the Census Bureau, and I would just note that this is public information. It's verifiable data. There are no black boxes involved with the presentation of this information. There are no models that can't be replicated by you or me or others who haven't signed confidentiality agreements to get access to protected databases. This is all publicly available, replicable study that I'd like to present to you. But this slide shows, it comes from the Iowa Public Utilities Commission. And just to back up for a second, I would argue that the patterns we're going to see in this slide and the ones that follow are, and the relationships between uncollectible accounts and arrearages hold across the country. And what we're showing here is that the level of, or the number of accounts that are in serious arrears, or even less than serious arrears, far exceed those number of accounts that are written off as uncollectible. Here, these are general residential accounts. The blue line represents the number of residential accounts since 1999 that are in arrears. So this is a sort of a monthly time series on this. The red line at the bottom is the accounts that have been written off as uncollectible or referred to a collection agency. So right now, this gap between the two lines, these are accounts that are not reported to the collection agencies. Under this proposal, the folks in between there would be reported, and therein lies the problem. There will be many new adverse reports that come from this regime. And I would also note that you can see that there was a tremendous uptick in this trend beginning in about 2004, 2005. So I think the credit and collection situation, at least as represented by Iowa here, you can see that it's gotten worse since that time when the first Perk study was conducted. So the data from that original study was from a period when generally arrears and disconnects were at a lower level than they are today. The next slide shows this is also from Iowa. This shows arrears and uncollectibles among energy assistance customers in that state. So you can see it's basically the same. It's the same relationship. The uncollectibles are the red line at the bottom. The blue bars are the arrears. In no month do the arrears are they less than the uncollectibles. So these folks would suffer under full utility credit reporting. Same idea in Massachusetts, and I should note that this table refers to households or customers with 60-day plus arrears. And you can see that for general residential customers, on the electric side, 15.4% in February of this year were behind. 11% of the general residential gas customers were, whereas only 0.5% of those customers had their accounts written off as uncollectible. Huge gap. Among low-income discount customers in Massachusetts, of course, not surprisingly, the arrears are much higher, 21.4 and 26.1% respectively for electric and gas customers. These are folks in Massachusetts below 200% of the federal poverty level, and similarly, as with general residential, only a tiny fraction of those folks had their accounts written off. So again, a huge gap and a cause for major concern. FICO did report. I don't know what they've disclosed since this came out fairly recently, but FICO has reported publicly that each 30-day payment, late payment, results in a degradation or damage to a FICO score of between 60 and 110 points, depending on where what the pre-existing credit score is. So if we assume that low-income customers are going to be late more often than higher-income customers, and also that those late reports will result in damage to credit scores, then there's a problem with this proposal. So just very quickly to recap where we've been, a lot of low-income customers are currently in arrears. Arrearages are increasing over time, but many of those accounts, a vast majority of them, are not written off as bad debt. Under full utility credit reporting customers, even those who pay a little bit late would have new adverse transactions recorded, and FICO has published that late payments, even a single late payment, results in damage to credit scores. Now, to move on quickly, full utility credit reporting is going to add a new layer of pressure in households that are already struggling to make ends meet and to stay current on their utility bills. A survey of conducted by the National Energy Assistance Directors Association, and by the way, this is all available up on their website, so feel free to go and take a look at it. But among LIHEAP recipients or participants in 2008, 32% reported going without food, 42% without medical or dental care. Many others did not fill a prescription. These are households that, by definition, don't have enough income to make ends meet at the end of the month. Their income is insufficient to pay for necessities in an ongoing basis. So this stick of full utility credit reporting, reporting to the credit bureaus, will only make this dynamic worse, and will likely lead to a further increase in deprivations in the areas of food, medicine, and other of life's essentials. Low-income households and utility customers are late because of that income and expense mismatch, not because of, in most cases, because of financial mismanagement or some other shortfall. Or shortcoming, I should say. In addition, there are tremendous seasonal variations in payments in many regions of the country. While it may be easier for households to stay current when bills are low in moderate weather months, when harsh weather comes, utility payments increase, and households with pressure on their incomes may have trouble in some months of the year and be late. Also, increasingly, because of dysfunctional energy markets around the country, there's increased price volatility, particularly in natural gas, and there are lots of unexpected billing increases that households have to deal with. Now, there is reliable data produced by the U.S. Census Bureau through the Survey of Income and program participation that clearly demonstrates the dynamic where income and other drivers impact the extent to which a respondent to the survey is late on their utility bill payment. This is 1998 data. The SIP is not conducted frequently, but I believe while the numbers you'll see in these charts have increased, the instances of late payments have increased dramatically since 1998. The relative dynamic is the same. So, for example, in this slide you see that the lowest income quintile of respondents was late on their or did not pay in full on a utility bill in 1998, almost 7 times more than the highest income quintile household. So again, the numbers, particularly at the bottom, have increased. The instances of late payment are now greater than 15%. However, the relative dynamic is the same. Similarly, race is another, there's tremendous disparity among African Americans and white respondents in late payments. So late payments resulting in adverse impacts on credit scores would be disproportionately distributed under full utility credit reporting. Household structure is another determinant. You can take a look at these slides more on your own time, but single-parent households are far more likely to be harmed than those of other structures. Respondents with disabilities were late more often than those without disabilities. Interestingly, health insurance coverage, another category explored in SIP, households without medical insurance were far more likely to be late on a utility bill than those with insurance. I would add that SIP has done additional analysis to rank which household economic hardships are most prevalent and most frequently experienced. It's interesting to note here that what is demonstrated in the SIP, and this was borne out in the most recent 2005 data, is that of all the hardships explored in the SIP survey, a missed energy payment is the most frequent. And the hardships that were explored include eviction, utility disconnection, phone disconnection, food hardships, medical hardships, missed rental or housing payments, and a couple of others. But a missed energy payment is at the top of the list in terms of frequency. So the question arises, why would we want to base alternative data reporting on the most frequently experienced hardship that respondents to this survey reported? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So moving along quickly here, it is true that the ability to pay and stay current on a utility bill varies widely across the states and certainly across regions in this country. Very quickly, the bill payment time frames allowed by regulatory utility commissions is a great example. In some states, customers have up to 45 days before a bill is even due, much less late. In other states, that time frame is as low as 7 days. So how is utility reporting to the credit agencies going to account for these differences? There are 51 state utility consumer protection and customer service rule structures operative across the country. No two of them are the same, and they all have significant bearing on the extent to which customers are able to stay connected to the system, pay on time, and even what constitutes a late payment. I don't believe that any national reporting system is going to be able to account for all these differences in a way that the reporting will be consistent and fair. Shut-off protections vary state to state. Some states have shut-off protections during times of extreme temperatures or during certain seasons of the year. Some states protect elderly consumers, some do not. Serious illness and disability protections exist in some states and not others. If a customer is protected by one of these provisions and yet is late on their bill, how will this reporting regimen that's been proposed here account for that? I don't see that working very well. Deferred payment agreements are another means by which states have said have recognized the unique nature of utility service and have set forth requirements on allowing customers essentially to carry arrears and stay connected to service. Will credit reporting to the bureaus reflect differences in these deferred payment agreements, or even reflect the extent to which a customer paying off an arrearage on these agreements should not be considered as having an adverse credit experience. So we know that access to affordable home energy and utility services are vital to an individual's health and safety, and that state and federal governments and recognizing the nature of this service as necessary, that they have adopted programs and provisions, particularly to help low-income and other vulnerable customers. I would assert that full utility credit reporting, no matter how you structure it, will operate contrary to many of these provisions and programs that have been operating in some cases for decades in states.
John, can you please wrap up? We've got a number of more panelists to finish.
Yep, I will finish in 2 minutes here, 1 minute if I can. Finally, I'd like to talk about the Fair Credit Reporting Act for just a second. I understand proponents of full utility credit reporting have proposed to preempt the authority of states to regulate the credit reporting practices of jurisdictional utility companies. We view this as this amendment as hostile to the FCRA and contrary to state regulatory and legislative oversight of utility practices. So we oppose full utility credit reporting and urge state policymakers to do the same. If a state wants to authorize this practice, we contend it should be only in cases of reporting seriously delinquent accounts that have been written off. Further, if the state wants to go this route, we urge that they only authorize this practice if the stated purpose is to help low-income customers establish credit history, that that authorization should be subject to a customer opt-in requirement. Thanks very much, and sorry to run over a little bit.
Thanks, John. We did have a number of questions, but we're going to hold those to the end and proceed to our next panelist, which is Jennifer Smith from CETA of Cook County.
we go. Good afternoon. This is Jennifer Smith, and I'm the Director for CETA's Home Energy Assistance Programs. Thank you to the Shriver Center for letting me put my 2 cents into this discussion this afternoon. So who is CETA? We're the designated community action agency for suburban Cook County. And we also operate energy assistance and weatherization programs within the city of Chicago. And our mission is to work in partnership with our communities to empower families and individuals to achieve self-sufficiency and improve their quality of life. We have 7 core assistance areas, from children and family services through to senior services. And for our home energy assistance programs, our largest program obviously is the LIHEAP program. We are now in process of implementing a statewide percentage of income payment program for utilities assistance, and we also have, we've been doing the Residential Energy Assistance Challenge program, which is actually a monthly case management program that we've had about 400 participants in over the last 3.5 years. So when the Shriver Center contacted me regarding this topic, I'd not really been involved with it. I had attended a session at the National Community Action Conference last year, and immediately I thought this could not be good for our low-income population. You know, as John said, many of the clients we see, they're scraping to make ends meet, keep shelter over their head, food on the table, prescriptions filled, children clothed, etc. You know, we always counsel our clients to pay at least something on their utility bill each month, but many times the utility bill is the last thing on their mind until they receive that disconnection notice. So of our LIHEAP population, about 68% of them fall under 100% of the federal poverty level. And for our REACH participants, although they're just a subsection of our whole LIHEAP population, they represented the whole very well. And this is, we did a study. There was an impact program evaluation and impact report done on our REACH program between the years of 2007, 2008, and 2009. And what we saw was for the 12 months before, it was 2008 participants that we actually focused on. For the 12 months before these households enrolled in REACH, only 48% of them were actually making full on-time payments every month towards their gas bill. And it was about 30% for the electric payments. The goal of our REACH program was to reduce the energy burden and help these households become more energy secure, so get them out of the disconnect, reconnect cycle. Success in the program was 6 monthly case manager meetings with the households, as well as they had to make 6 monthly on-time payments to their utilities. Out of all of the first 3 years of the program, less than 1/4 of the participants were actually able to fulfill the graduation requirements. And even after the program, those that were in it, we saw an increase slightly of their ability to make the on-time monthly payments. So for gas, it went from 48% to 50%, and for electric, it was from 30% to 31% respectively. The most interesting item that came out of the impact report was that it showed, though, that program success increased as the household income increased. So this shows that, you know, these households, if they could, they would make on-time monthly payments every month all year round. However, there are so many different barriers and obstacles that they're facing with on a daily basis that it's just not always possible. But after I talked to the Shriver Center, I began reaching out to my LIHEAP partners. I work very closely with NICOR Gas, who's our suburban Cook County natural gas provider, as well as People's Gas, who provide services in the city of Chicago. And of course, you know, they both told me that their LIHEAP customers were good payers, and they were the best clientele, and I was very surprised to hear that. Both reported about 10 or to 15% of customers on a monthly basis when they're doing, both organizations voluntarily are doing the full credit reporting now every month, but they both reported about 10 to 15% of the customers get negative credit reports. They're both using the same criteria. Is past due means no payment for over 60 days with over $100 balance, and then you'd get the negative ping on your credit report. And one thing that I learned was that LIHEAP grants are considered payments, so they're not marked any differently or distinguished differently than say a regular client payment. And you know, when I got off the phone with them, I thought, oh well, this is going to be a good thing. But after thinking about it some more, the data that I'm seeing, or that they provided to me with the negative credit, 10 to 15% of the overall customer base getting negative credit reports every month, just has me asking some more questions. Some data that I would like to see are for our local area is, okay, well, of our LIHEAP clients, how many of them are 30 to 60 and over 60 days late per month? What is the portion of that 10 to 15% of your population that is actually LIHEAP? Because I was not able to get that that information from them. You know, what concerns me as well is what about the clients that are low income, that are eligible for LIHEAP, but unfortunately because of funding we can't serve. Even in our highest funding year ever, we were only to reach statistically 40% of those eligible in our service territory. So I guess my conclusion is that more studies need to be done, or more data needs to be provided before I'm completely sold on that this full utility credit reporting would be good for our low-income constituency. Thank you again for letting me put in my 2 cents.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Just to let everybody know, we're going to swap presentations. Carol Wayman is going to be next. Carol, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. And I'm Carol Wayman with the Corporation for Enterprise Development. We're a national nonprofit that works to expand economic opportunity for low-income families. And one of the things that we do is work to help people get access to credit and help low-income families buy homes, go to college, start businesses. And the practitioners that we were working with were having all sorts of problems because they didn't have credit scores. And so they had very limited access to credit, and it was making it very difficult for them to buy a house and start a business. And we were working on spending years helping people establish a credit score. And I was talking to, folks who were doing credit builder loans and credit builder types of outreach and helping people take on debt. And when you're trying to encourage people to save, a program that tells you we want you to save to buy something, but you need to take out a loan to buy this other thing, just doesn't make sense. And when I was trying to think of solutions to this, I was fortunate to hear Dr. Turner make a presentation. I thought, my gosh, this is exactly what we need. This is not the answer to asset building. No one that I know is saying that this is the answer to asset building, but is saying that this is one way to really, through no cost to the federal government, no financial education monies, no debt building counseling, just have everyone who is paying bills automatically scored. It increases the accuracy. It helps target populations who've really struggled, specifically widows who information was always kept in their husband's name, women fleeing domestic violence who frequently don't have a credit score of their own, or if they do, their former abuser has destroyed that, or identity theft. we've heard a great deal of support for this idea among identity theft opponents, because they say one of the biggest ways people steal your identity and start renting an apartment, the first thing they do is get a utility bill. And so if you knew that your utility data was being reported on your credit report, you'd be much, much less likely to find out the way it is now, which is at collections, that someone has stolen your identity. So in closing, this is not the answer to everything about asset building, but from our perspective, Dr. Turner has done an incredible amount of empirical research that would move millions of people away from predatory lending and payday lending and the harm that not having access to affordable credit does, and help families increase their accuracy of their credit scores and access to more affordable and appropriate credit.
Thank you, Carol. And we're going to have our next presenter and last presenter, Terry Clemens, who is with the National Credit Reporting Association. Terry?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Susan and Karen, and thank you to the Shriver Center for addressing this very important issue and inviting me to participate in today's discussion. Can you see my screen?
We cannot yet.
There it is. Yes, we can see it now.
Thanks.
Okay, great. We'll start off with a little bit about the National Credit Reporting Association, NCRA. For those of you who have not heard of us, it was founded in 1992 to represent the reseller credit reporting industry. Resellers are specialty credit reporting agencies that represent our specialty as mortgage credit reporting for most of our members, but we also do tenant screening and employment screening as well. Mortgage credit reports are different from the credit reports that TransUnion, Experian, and Equifax produce because it's a multiple repository report. It's produced to meet the criteria set forth by Fannie, Freddie, and HUD specifically for mortgage lending. It's a hybrid report that contains the data from all three and then more data as needed. NCRA membership contains 80% of the credit reporting agencies that can meet the guidelines for producing mortgage reports for Fannie, Freddie, and HUD lending. During our existence, NCRA has produced two major credit industry studies. The original one back in March of 1994 that I'm going to talk about a little bit today. We brought it out of the dust because it's very important to this issue. And one in 2002 where we partnered with the Consumer Federation of America to do a credit score accuracy study in which we compared and contrasted the credit scores from over 1.5 million actual consumer mortgage applications. I believe it's important to start by addressing that alternative data is really not a recent issue. Prior to the mid-1990s and the automated underwriting systems, Fannie, Freddie, and HUD actually required alternative or non-traditional data, as it's called currently, to be included in all mortgage credit reports. The standard mortgage credit report back then was a two repository of the what is now 3, but previously 5 national credit repositories. A two repository residential mortgage credit report, or RMCR, and any information about the consumer that the consumer is required to disclose on the HUD 1003 or the Uniform Residential Mortgage Loan Application. Any information disclosed on that credit report or credit application had to be investigated. The study I previously talked about found that 30% of all RMCRs back in 1994 contained alternative or non-traditional credit, as it's called today, and used in mortgage lending. 19% of that data was actually from trade lines on the application disclosed by the consumer to the loan officer. 11% of that data was from the inquiries not represented by trade lines after the inquiry was made. Fannie, Freddie, and HUD, to a lesser extent, but due to their reliance upon Fannie and Freddie's automated underwriting systems, moved away from alternative or non-traditional credit for the addition of the third repository in the automated underwriting systems. They moved to a cheaper and faster credit report, so they just thought getting all three and doing away with this other information would help, which in reality, that added third repository delivered 2% unique data and 98% of data that had already been reported to one of the other two bureaus. The cheaper and faster mantra was the driving force, and the bottom line of this new requirement was a loss of almost 30% of data that impacted those who could least afford it the most. It also gave the three national credit repositories a monopoly in the mortgage credit market and helped them eliminate more than 1,500 independent CRAs that help consumers get a true picture of their credit history reported for mortgage lenders, landlords, employers, and others who utilize this niche in the market. We have a question that I think needs to be addressed here, and what is alternative or non-traditional about an installment account that's secured by an automobile? I'm going to focus on this as an example of trade lines that are missing from the system, because the National Association of Buy Here, Pay Here car dealers estimate there's more than 40,000 Buy Here, Pay Here car dealers in the United States, with virtually none of them reporting their good credit accounts. We've talked a lot about utilities and telecoms today, and they seem to be the only option for non-traditional data that's missing from the system, but this is far from true. We focus on that because that fits the repository business model, the national credit repositories. They have thresholds of 500 or 1,000 active accounts to get the data into the system, unless, of course, it's a collection data, like utilities. The collections almost always hit the system because collection agencies and the public record systems, the small claims courts and other courts work as good aggregators to get all the bad data into the system. But missing trade lines that are typical trade lines that you would see if the trade line was with Citibank or Bank of America are missing from furniture and appliance stores, home and auto repair centers, hardware stores. Millions of collection or non-collection accounts are available and are not getting reported to the system only due to the size of the creditor's portfolio. So we ask, why should the business model of the creditor determine how complete a consumer's credit history is, especially when many of these smaller creditors operate in parts of inner cities where they're the only creditor option available for some consumers? In our perspective, on-time or past-due reporting, or on-time and past-due reporting, full-file reporting, regardless of the outcome, is the key to credit file accuracy. If the system is going to reward or penalize consumers for obtaining or not obtaining of credit, you have too thin of a file, you're obviously hurt. We've talked about that already with other panelists. If you have too large of a file and are overextended, you're obviously hurt. But when you ignore a segment of the creditors, it seems to be that that is gaming the system at the peril of both the consumers and the lenders at times. We'd really like to point out that this is also not credit repair. We're talking about both good and bad accounts to be reported for a complete representation of the consumer's actual credit history. Again, the collection agencies and public records system pick up the bad accounts, primarily leaving the good accounts from the small creditors not being reported. The only thing that should be important in looking at accounts that are out there, that are actual accounts that consumers have, is the revolving or installment, the type of account that it is, and whether the account has been paid on time or not. The type of information that is utilized all the time if the account is listed with one of the traditional creditors. There have been some attempts made to incorporate this information. The FICO expansion score, PRBC, and others have worked to try to get this information into the system of lending. The expansion score in particular was designed specifically for this. However, there's a score stigmatism about the expansion system, and many lenders find it difficult to work with. A lot of industry education needs to be done on this because it's sadly missing or has been skewed by certain parties due to a conflict of interest in the outcome of the transaction that has misrepresented much of its reliability or predictability. VantageScore has reported use of alternative data. A study that they conducted with Experian data in 2007 found that 21%, or 11.9 million subprime loans, or 2.5 million consumers, could have been moved with their scoring model from subprime into prime. One of the questions that I've heard a lot of industry professionals ask is, how are the missing data elements from the system that are not known to FICO or anyone else known to VantageScore? If the data is missing and it can't be factored into FICO, how is it automatically being factored in and scored with Vantage? Much of this data requires manual verification. You have to phone, fax, email, use the internet, three-way calls with caller ID, and it needs to be done with a third party that's not vested in the outcome of the transaction for it to be reliable. The use of alternative data as documented by consumers or as verified by mortgage lenders in the early 2000s was just filled with fraud. Fannie and Freddie relied upon it initially, then they've pushed it away from it, and they've pushed away to a point where they now require restrictive underwriting guidelines and punitive pricing models to actually use this data. And a lot of it is based upon their own mishandling of the previous ways they documented this. Allowing the mortgage originators that are only paid when the loan closes to verify this data was similar to putting the mouse in charge of the cheese. I think one of the most interesting factors in this is that the current federal law may actually require this information to be considered, and it's now being ignored. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act states specifically about the use of credit history and alternative data, or non-reported data. I've highlighted a couple sections of the ECOA section 202.6 here, which covers the rules concerning the evaluation of credit applications. It talks about credit history and the extent that a creditor must consider the credit history in evaluating the creditworthiness of similarly qualified applicants. Where their credit worthiness of the creditor, they shall consider 1, 2, and I'd like to really highlight number 3. And that is that at the applicant's request, the credit history, when available, of any account reported in the name of the applicant's spouse, or the former spouse, that the applicant can demonstrate accurately reflects the applicant's credit worthiness, must be considered. The ECOA supplement, the official staff interpretation, goes on to talk about the types of credit references, and again points out that at the applicant's request, the creditor must consider the credit information not reported through a credit bureau when the information relates to the same type of credit references and history that the creditor would consider if reported through a credit bureau. So I go back to the type of accounts that are missing. Millions of accounts from tens of thousands of creditors are missing from the system that are traditional accounts. Car loans, furniture loans, installment and revolving loans of all different types that are missing from the system only due to the fact that the actual creditor is smaller than what the threshold is to meet the repository guidelines for access into the system. Now, looking at this ECOA, one of the things you must take into consideration is, what does consider actually mean? I mean, is it acceptable just to say, okay, you told me you have a car loan and a revolving account with the furniture store down the street from where you live. I've considered that, and I still say no, or I'm still going to charge you an extra 5%. Is that acceptable? I think there needs to be some heavy analysis into the ECOA and how this pertains to what the current lending practices are, especially at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac when it looks at home loans and some of the punitive practices that they've put in for underwriting guidelines and pricing models for the use of this data. Consumer and industry education in this section of the law is greatly needed. It seems that there's some, with the ECOA especially, some selective enforcement going on, and it's very unfortunate that this part of the ECOA, which gets to the heart of the ECOA's intent, is being ignored. In closing, I'd like to hit a couple of points again. That the use of alternative data is not new. It just needs a respectability boost because it's been used improperly in the past, and there needs to be incentive for lenders to use it, and that could be federal law. Fannie and Freddie are some of the biggest obstacles in the use of alternative data in the mortgage marketplace. There's a major disconnect between the policies at Fannie and Freddie, the amount of alternative data and consumers that could be benefited by alternative data out there, and how much alternative data is actually being used in transactions. The gap is enormous. I'd also like to remind everyone that utilities and telecoms are not the only alternative or non-traditional credit out there that needs to be looked at. There's a lot of other trade lines out there that are considered alternative because they're not being reported, but they're actually very traditional trade lines, and that they can help immensely in determining a consumer's true credit worthiness. Also, federal law, Equal Credit Opportunity Act, Section 202.6b6, may actually require these accounts to be considered currently in lending if the consumer reports them to the lender. So consumer education on this is critical. Thank you very much for being part of today's discussion.
Thank you, Terry. I'd like to apologize to the participants since we have run late. I'd like to very quickly ask our last two polling questions. Again, at the beginning of the presentations, we asked whether or not you believe including alternative data will increase or decrease low-income families' access to the mainstream credit industry. And we'd like to ask that question again to see if today's presentation has influenced your perspective at all. Okay, it looks like 50% believe that it will increase access to mainstream credit, and 29% are unsure. The second question that we had asked was, assuming it does increase access to credit, will such alternative credit reporting increase, decrease, or leave unchanged low-income families' credit scores? And it looks like scores are relatively changed here in that increased 37% and unsure 30%. I'd like to tell you that we will be sending a link to a resource page which will have all of the copies of today's presentations as well as a full audio recording of the webinar. That will be available to you through email that we will send. I'd like to open up the question and answer now. Since we are running late and I know that some people may need to leave, I want to let you know that any questions that are being asked, we will send to the panelists offline and have them email answers back to you. So we apologize for being late, but for those of you who can stay on the line, I'd like to start with question and answer now. John, when you were speaking, there were several questions regarding your information and whether you were talking mostly about accounts that are more than 90 days late.
Yeah, accounts that are more than 90 days late, I'm not sure exactly what the questions are referring to, but generally those are the ones, if a customer is not in a payment agreement at that point, those are the ones more likely to be written off as uncollectible. But the arrearages I was referring to in the slides were from Iowa. Those are 30 days or more past the due date. In Massachusetts, they were 60 days or more beyond the due date. So I'm not sure exactly what the question is getting at.
Okay. Terry, one of our attendees works with victims of domestic violence, and they often find it difficult to build a credit score on their own, either because they have never had anything in their names or that their abuser destroyed their credit. This type of automatic reporting that we're talking about seems to make a lot of sense. Do you know how long it takes to create a credit score from scratch, and how can full filing reporting hasten the improvement of a credit score?
Well, each scoring model sets a certain level for a score to be calculated. You usually need 3 trade lines to create a score that are reported for a period of at least 6 months. But yes, the full file reporting, if they have utilities in their name, in the section talking about the utilities on this, that will greatly help them establish credit. If they have had other, again, the small creditor accounts that they have had with a local retailer of some type, this, if it can be reported when they apply for credit, could assist them. There's no way to score that at this time other than the alternative scoring models, the expansion score or others. Now, that is being addressed by different organizations, and that's why I believe this topic of conversation is so important, because it is somewhat impractical at this time, so that there needs to be change in this area, specifically to assist consumers like you pointed out from this question.
Okay. And another one of our attendees asked about identity theft. Dr. Turner, can you speak a little bit about how automatic reporting might help someone who's been the victim of identity theft?
Absolutely. I'll give you an example. I was recently interviewed on Mari Franks, who's a noted national identity theft expert, on her radio show Privacy Piracy, and she alluded to the same analogy that Carol Wayman discussed, that she works with victims of identity theft each and every day, and we're talking about now over 10 million victims nationally. And she has long advocated, she told me on the radio publicly, that energy, utility, and telecoms data be fully reported, because most victims who experience identity theft learn about it, or many victims, not most, learn about it through collections notices they receive from a utility company in a state in which they don't live. They say, hey, I live in Virginia, I don't live in New Jersey, what's this about? And then it's a collection on their credit file. And it's very, very difficult at that point to clean up that messy process. It takes a lot of time, a lot of, in some cases, money as well, and you endure a lot of hardship. I mean, a collection will slam your credit score, and there's lots of context on that. Now, however, the FACT Act has given consumers access to 3 free credit reports a year, 1 from each of the major repositories. And if this were reported in regular intervals, a victim of identity theft could see on their credit file that, gee, all these trade lines that I don't know what they are, they could then actually call the utility company, they could alert the credit bureau, they could actually nip the identity theft in the bud before it's too late, before it goes to collection, before it becomes a burden and difficult. So this would be a very powerful tool to detect and prevent and dramatically reduce identity theft. And for that reason, there's support from advocates in the privacy and identity theft community on this issue.
Thank you. Another question that has been asked is, currently, can a person request that their utility company or telecom provider report good payment history? That's for any of the panelists.
This is Michael Turner. I'll give a quick answer. Of course you can request it. If they're not reporting, they're unlikely to do so. It's from a business process perspective, subjecting the reporting to the individual's decision is extremely cumbersome and just it's cost impractical. If you're going to allow someone on an individual basis to determine whether that would be reported, you also have to allow them to stop reporting. So it gets to this notion of opt-in. We have a voluntary credit reporting system and a regulatory regime that's been in place for over 40 years. It's opt-in in the sense of the consumer provides consent for a party with a permissible purpose to access their credit history. It's not opt-in in terms of I'm going to select which credit card I'm going to have reported. I'm going to select which loan or which line of credit to have reported because the outcome is predictable. You'll select to have only those which you know you'll pay on time reported, and then the database becomes homogeneous. Everybody looks the same. Everybody pays all the time, and therefore becomes worthless. And we have no more ability to assess credit risk, and we'll go to credit rationing, and we'll go to manual underwriting. And I can guarantee you if we go down that path, the hardest hit are going to be the lower income and the credit disadvantaged. So, but both from a business process and from just a risk assessment perspective, that's an extraordinarily impractical approach.
Do any of the other panelists have anything to add? For John Howitt, one of the audience members asked that you seem to indicate that access to credit has nothing to do with wealth building. If I understood this, doesn't that mean that losing access to mainstream credit would not affect the financial health of low-income consumers?
Well, I didn't say that access to credit had nothing to do with wealth building. What I said was that credit reporting is not the cornerstone of asset building, and because that was one of the assumptions that we started with at the beginning of this program. I do believe that access to affordable credit is important in poverty alleviation strategies and poverty mitigation strategies. And I also believe that lowering credit scores is contrary to this objective of improving access to affordable credit.
Thank you, John. Some of our I keep calling them panelists, audience has also suggested that if a bad score is better than no score, why can't we just assign a baseline score to everyone? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
What would it be based on? I mean, if there's no information in the system, how do you score it?
Another question that was asked is that it seems like everyone, especially members of Congress, are supporting financial education, although they're unwilling to spend money on it. Does anyone have any idea of the cost comparison between financial education and automatic reporting? Is it easier or cheaper to allow automatic reporting rather than to fund nonprofits and other programs for credit repair and credit education? Michael, would you like to, or Dr. Turner, would you like to take a stab at that question?
You can call me Michael. That's all right. Sure. One of the I think most elegant aspects of this solution, and I agree with Carol Wayman wholeheartedly, it's not the golden bullet or the silver bullet that will enable and facilitate and solve all of asset building problems. It's one tool. And we've demonstrated, and by the way, I'd like to add other studies done by the Federal Trade Commission, the FDIC, and the Federal Reserve Bank corroborate our work and our work with Brookings. And by the way, just actually, the results we got weren't based on just two. In fact, DTE, which was referenced, wasn't even part of our sample. Our sample was the entire universe nationally. We had actually files from every state, so therefore it couldn't have been just two. But 8.1 million files nationally with, I would hazard a guess, more than 100 companies, and I know that far more than 100 utility companies are fully reporting presently. So not just two, that's very misleading. But the cost is nothing to the consumer. The cost effectively is borne by data furnishers and repositories. It would cost the government nothing more than the stroke of a pen, if they want to basically codify allowing utility companies to do what they're already allowed to do, which is voluntarily participate in the National Credit Information Sharing System to enable lenders to get a more universal picture and improve underwriting. I mean, at the end of the day, what we're talking about is quite simple. We're talking about a very large segment of our society that are being disadvantaged and blocked out of the mainstream because they're invisible and because lenders use automated solutions that need data to enable them to make decisions about accept, reject, and the terms. And we've again measured quantitatively how this impacts those by excluding or including the data in question. And the results are incontrovertible, both from the 05-06 period, the DTE data that we've published that's on our website from 07-08, and then the material I just presented from 010. It hasn't changed. So it costs the government nothing. It's a great public policy tool. The costs are borne by the private sector. Education, how long have we been doing financial literacy education and toward what ends? And I'd like to see studies that are showing anywhere near the impact in terms of credit access that this one single incomplete but partial and promising solution has borne. Our studies show results that have already happened. They're happening each and every day. They've already impacted lives. When you look at those who are new to credit through alternative data, they're able to access mainstream credit at 4 times the rate of thin file consumers who don't have alternative credit. And they have a greater credit limit, but they're more credit responsible. So again, these are actual results. It's not speculative. It's not theoretical. This is happening. This solution's already been demonstrated. It's proven. I don't know why we even have to answer how would this work. How are they going to solve this? Models already accounting for this data. They're already being used by lenders. It's already being used in credit granting. It's not a how is this going to happen. It's already happened.
John, do you have any last words, and then we'll end the webinar?
Yeah, this has been very interesting. So thanks very much to the Shriver Center and to folks who've listened in, the other panelists as well. Michael, I'm very interested to take a closer look at your information regarding the 100 utility companies that are fully reporting to the big three right now. My understanding is that a vast majority of those, except for a couple of notable exceptions, are on the telecom side. But if you have different information and could post it for us, I would find that very, very helpful. Maybe others here would as well.
With that, I'd like to thank everyone for participating on today's panel. We will be sending you a link to the resource page that will have additional information as well as copies of today's presentations and an audio recording of the webinar. We'd also ask you to complete the survey and subscribe to ACTS for future events and information. We will be sending out, as we have more information about alternative credit reporting, to you. For any questions or comments concerning this webinar, please feel free to contact Susan Rataka at the information listed above. Again, thank you very much for your participation, and we apologize for going late.